we were actors in a theatre where it was demanded that the cast come on earlier, and the hysterical giggles are not part of it. I'm Judith Patton. I keep saying, co-created the show at the start of the century. Keep saying, a very good friend of All Energy, but it's actually two very good friends of All Energy, because Ronnie, I think you actually spoke on the deep water lock that Alan yes, you were on that session when he said, you can have a whole session on what we're going to do. And I said, can I have one afterwards? Might be short if it doesn't work well, but it was beautiful. I'm sorry, I'm also getting into conversation mode. I'm supposed to be telling you that there are no fire alarms planned. If any bells ring, follow the green man. The SEC people will take great care of you. I'm also supposed to say, switch your phone to silent, but don't switch it off, because the app on your phone will give you amazing information. But without any more ado, I'm going to... Oh, no, oh yes, there is more ado, because if you've come to see Sir Ian Wood in conversation with Sir Jim McDonald, I'm afraid poor Ian is indisposed, and they will take up the tale from now. Over to you, gentlemen.
Thank you. Judith, can everyone hear us? Thank you very much, and good afternoon. Ronnie and I will introduce ourselves very briefly shortly, and then we're going to reflect on one or two things that I'm sure will be of interest to you. And then post this session, more than happy to speak to you. Ian would have been here, so Ian's not very ill, but Ian's incapacitated with a wee mobility issue just now, and he and I had planned to do this for about a year. When I heard that Ian was not able to travel, I decided to phone a good friend and colleague of mine, one Ronnie Bonnar. What I didn't realise when I called him on Saturday was he was halfway through the West Highland Walk. I imagined him with his purple face and blisters in his feet. But Ronnie, you were very kind enough to accept the invitation.
I was, yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned the red face, Jim, because it's not high blood pressure, it is sunburn. But I had a great walk, and I was really humbled that Jim asked me to come along today and fill in big shoes for Sir Ian Wood, who actually couldn't be here today. So I'm looking forward to the conversation.
And Ian actually offered to join us, but the dynamics might not have been the same. It would have been me sitting up here, and Ian would have been a gigantic face on the screen, which wouldn't have quite felt like a fireside chat. So anyway, Ronnie and I have worked together for a long time, but Ronnie, it might be helpful. You'll be known by many people in the hall, but might as well just letting them know your professional background.
Yeah, and actually the project that Judith referred to in her introductory remarks was my transition into the offshore renewable space. So I've spent almost 40 years in the offshore energy sector, the first 20 years with a supply chain company called Halliburton KBR. Spent about half the time in the UK and half the time overseas. And following on from a pilot technical demonstration project that was effectively financed by SSE and a Canadian oil and gas company, Talisman Energy, when we delivered the Beatrice offshore wind demonstration project between 2005 and 2008. I then moved fully into the offshore renewable space. So I was involved in a small startup company called Sienna Renewables between 2008 and 2011. And then went on to be sort of a prime driver in some of the key offshore wind projects in the east coast of Scotland, which took me through to about 2015. In 2015, I stepped down from a full-time executive role and started doing senior advisory work and non-exec roles. And I'm proud to say that I've been on the Offshore Renewable Energy Catapult board since 2019 and chaired the organisation for the last 2.5 years. And it's been terrific looking at what that type of organisation does from the outside as a developer in the early years, and just so enlightening when you're involved in that type of organisation and you see the fantastic work that we do to support and accelerate the deployment of offshore renewables. So great to have this chance to speak to yourself, Jim, and share our thoughts with the audience as well.
Great. And Ronnie and I have those connections. Myself and my research group at the time worked on the electrical system design for the Beatrice project, which was really a groundbreaker at that time. It reflects in many ways that if we're going to break ice, if we're going to be building an industry, the risk appetite to do things is really important. You know, managing it properly is key, but that entrepreneurial activity that involves high technical innovation as well breaks ground for future projects.
You actually did a study way back then on serial manufacturing as well, because we were doing two units. The first one, Jim and his team did a lot of analysis on the the process that we went through, and we are actually able to identify how we could improve that. We still haven't made major strides forward, and we're going to touch on these things as part of this discussion, but the need for serial production, etc., it's not a new initiative. It's been around for 10, 15 years.
And many of you in the hall know that I'll give you a very brief reference to me. So my day job is principal of the University of Strathclyde. I do a few other things. I'm proud to say I'm president of the Royal Academy of Engineering, the first Scot to have that role, which was a surprise for me when I took up the role. I'm vice chairman of Scottish Power, and I've actually just left the board of the Weir Group, where I was senior independent director. But I've replaced that very large mining company with a small high-tech company in Dublin called Supernode. Some of you may remember Eddie O'Connor, the great hero of mine, from the electricity supply industry to electricity to mainstream, and Eddie set up the company. Sadly passed away in the new year, but it wasn't before he'd asked me to come onto the board as senior independent director, looking at high temperature superconducting materials to basically transform transmission systems. So with all of that, there's a few things we want to touch on, hopefully of interest to you. But Ronnie, I mean, you and I have been friends and colleagues for long enough to know that even 25, 30 years ago, we were talking about the need for Scotland to capture this generational opportunity for renewables. We're still saying it, as we should do. But I mean, just in terms of scaling that, I mean, your broad perspectives about Scotland in that space of renewable transition.
Yeah, well, I think and I genuinely hope that we're on the cusp of, this green industrialisation of our country. We've been talking about it for long enough, and we need to take some actions now that are going to deliver that. I mean, if you look at some of the numbers associated with the sector that we currently have, the ScotWind, the offshore wind leasing round, the largest commercial scale leasing round globally, the developers that are involved in that process have committed over £20 billion of investment, providing the right numbers are in place and the right processes have been adopted. Scotland's only carbon capture cluster, the Acorn project, has the necessary approvals to proceed, and forecast around 20,000 jobs will be generated during the process and the life cycle of that project. And we're seeing the creation of a number of pioneering green energy projects. A great example is the unique public-private partnership between BP and Aberdeen City Council to significantly expand existing hydrogen production. So the projects are there. There's absolutely no doubt about that. And I've just mentioned very few. That's the tip of the iceberg. The opportunity is absolutely huge. And because of our world-class energy heritage, we have the people, the skills, and the companies to deliver them. The challenge is, for everyone in this room and outside this room, is to ensure that we, industry and government, make the necessary interventions to ensure we extract as much economic value from them as possible. Frankly, in my view, and being an observer of the progress that we've made for the last 15 years, we need to do this much faster than we are. Otherwise, there's a real danger that we'll miss another fantastic opportunity in this sector.
For those of you that were in the first session this morning, I had the pleasure of chairing it with a great panel. I'm sure those of you who were in the room agreed. I just reflect something again. It's in 2006, a friend of mine, Nick Stern, now Lord Nick Stern, produced a report called The Economics of Climate Change. I would commend it to you. It's still entirely relevant. I work still with Nick. He and I sit in the Prime Minister Council for Science and Technology. He's an economist. He was a professor at London School of Economics. He then took a very senior UK government role, but is passionate and such an informed man about what needs to be done. And the basic premise, and this is the engineer's perspective, of course, there's the whole economic regulation and investment framework that needs to sit around it. But as we go through this transition, we need to create industries. We need to create jobs. And the Scottish Government, probably mid this year, will publish their energy strategy and just transition plan. And there's no better just transition than well-paid jobs that allow people to live, allow people to contribute, pay taxes, and then this circle continues. But Nick's proposition still holds water, so please look at the Stern report. I would also say in broad terms, before we maybe reflect on another big industry transition that Scotland went through about 60 or so years ago in the oil and gas industry, and Ronnie might say something about that. We talk very often about the energy trilemma, and that's meaningful. As an engineer, I like to think that way because I can imagine the diagram. but this trade-off between cost, decarbonisation and security. And if you imagine those vectors, they tend to be pulling in opposite directions, and that really does give us a problem. That's challenging enough. But as an engineer, let me destroy the English language even further. But there's a quadrilemma. And back to the Stern proposition, as we deal with this, let us build economic opportunity. Let's build industries. Let's build value. And the fifth component, the quintilemma, if you will, is that we need to bring society with us. And that, I think that penny's dropping much more often. You know, in the city of Glasgow here, there's a commitment from the City Council, which was reinforced during COP26. They want to create jobs, they want to create opportunities. But we need political leadership, we need the space for industry to invest, and we need innovation. But I will always play back, particularly in Glasgow, that was the second city of the empire, if I may use that term, about 100 or so years ago. We need entrepreneurship. Yeah. And if we're going to deal with net zero, if we're going to deal with delivering a green future, you know, let's show that pioneering engineering capability, innovation and investment risk that will drive things forward. But of course, people that you've worked closely with, Ronnie, in the oil and gas industry, been through that transition. And while oil and gas, you know, have challenges to face up to, yep, how they actually built the industry is interesting, from which we might take lessons.
Absolutely. And I mentioned in the sort of introduction for myself, I've got about an equal balance between the time I've worked in renewables and the time I've worked in oil and gas. I wasn't around when oil and gas activity started, but I was there at a relatively early stage. And when I look back, you know, so I worked for 20 years in oil and gas, both at home and abroad. And when I look back at what that industry achieved over a relatively short period of time, it really is incredible. But you didn't realise that at the time. You know, you saw these things just happening and you didn't appreciate what was going on in the background to make these things happen. It's actually quite interesting for me as well. My first job out of university was as a field engineer at Highlands Fabricators, which is the NIG fabrication facility that Global Energy Group now operates. And I also worked part of my time in oil and gas at the FRSE facility. And it's great to see the investment that's been taking place at Global Energy Group for quite some time at NIG to make it a world-class facility, which it was in the oil and gas days, but it's proven to have the same similar profile in offshore renewables. And we saw that earlier this week, the start of real work taking place at FRSE with investment by Avantis and £100 million that was announced to make sure that that can move forward. So we're doing all the right things to make the facilities available that are going to enable us to accelerate this industry going forward. Again, when I look back at oil and gas, and we do have them in offshore renewables as well, but the industry was full of people with a can-do attitude. That was always the case. There was nothing more certain than the project being delivered. And the key thing was identifying key challenges that were effectively hampering progress and coming up with innovative solutions, both technical and systematic, to make sure that we could get over that challenge. And that led to a burgeoning industry, both not only in the UK, but globally. And I did mention that I've worked some of my time overseas, about 10 years, in various different locations. I spent some time in the Middle East, the Far East, and laterally in South America. And wherever I went, there was an abundance of Scots, whether it's good news or bad news, there was abundance of Scots and Scottish companies that were leveraging their experience in the North Sea. And that was recognised worldwide as where the centre of excellence was for oil and gas technology and innovation. And we've got that exact same opportunity for the offshore renewable sector here in Scotland.
Some of you, I think the audience were involved in this. You may remember, it's about 2 years ago now, Ronnie, I chaired the group that produced the strategic impact assessment. Yep. It was for floating wind in Scotland, which was a fascinating project for me, and it was a precursor to try and get things lined up between government, industry, investors and the innovation community, including supply chain. That point that Ronnie made is really important. Underpinning all of the work that you've done, Ronnie, and what flowed from the start of the oil and gas industry was projects. There was certainty of investment. There was the skills base that sat behind it. And once, and you were there in the industry, I've worked with them but not in them, having that understanding that you learn how to deploy projects in your own country, and that's where that ScotWind opportunity is so important, whether it's floating offshore wind or deployed fixed bed. If we build that capability in Scotland, and we need to build it quickly because we're short of people, which we'll touch on shortly as well, if we build those skills against a project portfolio, then we're facing it into a market that's 100 times as big as the Scottish opportunity. So it's the oil and gas model from Aberdeen, but played into renewables in many ways. So if we deal with Scotland, build the supply chain, the skills base, there'll be some transition across the oil and gas boundary because they understand offshore operations, deployment, servicing, as well as the construction stage. That's really important. And you remind me, Ronnie, it was about 12 years ago the price of oil and gas nosedived. It was about a decade.
And it's had a couple of dips during my period, not because of me, I'd like to add, but it's had a couple of dips during my time in oil and gas. When I joined in 1985, it was going through a bit of a dip then as well, and about 12 years later
But during that, a project called Pilot appeared, which brought industry together, typically competitive companies, i.e. companies that competed against each other, their supply chain and government support, and very quickly they reset their vision for the industry and they drove innovation into the industry. They worked shoulder to shoulder in terms of protecting jobs, to create the capability when the natural cyclicality of the oil and gas came back. Aberdeen, which it hit Aberdeen pretty hard, let's be frank, but what it did was it kept them fit and it kept them there, as opposed to companies closing down. And we need to see at the start-up phase, if we build capability, trust, confidence, and industrial community, then that makes you robust against, shall we say, the vagaries of the market.
Absolutely, and I couldn't agree more with that. This theme of collaboration is going to come through this discussion, and I think it is so important because you mentioned that pilot project, and I remember being very active in that pilot project. But if you think how long the industry had been operating before pilot, it was decades, and we really need to learn from that, there's an element of competition in this sector, and there always will be. In any industrial sector, there will be. There wasn't too much collaboration in the early days because when the AMR was completed and the CFD mechanism was put in place, there was contracts awarded at what I would think are more credible prices than ones that have been issued recently. So there wasn't a real need to collaborate as much as we need to going forward. We're now in a very cost competitive environment. There's a cost of living crisis, so we need to make sure that we enforce almost that collaboration to make sure we get the cost reduction that everybody's going to benefit from. And what we could learn from oil and gas is don't wait 30 years before you do that. Let's get involved and do that now.
We'll come on to touch on some projects that many of you will be familiar with. You've just triggered a thought, Ronnie. That's what you do when you have a fireside chat. We're not having a glass of whiskey here, but it triggers some parallel thoughts.
It's just
the Royal Academy of Engineering about 2 years ago, the UK government asked us to reflect on national capability. Much of that being triggered by what we all experienced in COVID-19, where we'd actually seen the, shall we say, the reduction of pharma manufacturing capability, which made us very, dependent on international manufacturing. But when the Academy looked at this more roundly as to what the key components about national resilience and national capability, we looked at 4 big national international challenges. You remember the WannaCry ransomware attack? There was the Lancaster flooding, the Icelandic volcano. I remember 20 of my staff being stranded in the west coast of America. It took me longer than it should have been to get them back from the west coast of America. I don't know how long that volcano was spewing dust. And the other one was Fukushima. And we did a very detailed analysis of what the components were for reacting to it. Now, I want to put this in a positive vein insofar as it's the positive opportunity for renewables. The components were interesting, but one surprised me. It was innovation, investment, policy that supported the key objectives, skills. The other one that really cried out was networks and relationships were fundamental to effectively dealing with all of that. So effectively what you're saying, Ronnie, which I agree with, is collaboration, networks. You can compete and collaborate at the right times. And just now, the challenge and the opportunity that's facing Scotland needs us to work together to move towards it, which was one of the key findings of the strategic impact assessment. We needed an industry-led, industry collaborative. Scottish Power, SSE, the Ørsted, the OEMs, the supply chain partners, so that they started to create the underpinning that allowed them to be effective in competing. But we've talked about projects and how important those are, Ronnie, because that's what attracts the investment. And you mentioned a few already, but there's a pipeline building.
There absolutely is. And I guess projects, you tend to talk about projects, but an industry is just an accumulation of thousands of projects. That's ultimately what we're targeting here. And I think we're getting to the point where we're now becoming an industry. Because the way things have been developed, we're now looking at much longer term views for securing supply chain, etc., which is the right way to go. But when we look back at the development of offshore wind, since I've been involved, the progress that's been made is incredible. You know, there's no doubt that the UK are world leading in the deployment of offshore wind. Primarily in fixed bottom, but we've got a great opportunity in front of us in terms of floating. Where we've failed miserably is being able to maximise the opportunities for local supply chain. Yeah. And really, we cannot go through another cycle of floating offshore wind as opposed to fixed and end up with the same outcome. I mean, shame on all of us in this room and outside this room if that's ultimately what materialises. So it's really key, it's really important that we develop a really strong, robust local supply chain. But these need certain things to be in place to give them the level of confidence that they need, both for bringing in external investment and for investing for the long term in the facilities that are already there. There's a huge opportunity on our doorstep. There's absolutely no doubt about that. The scale of fixed bottom offshore wind is big. The scale of floating offshore wind is going to be even bigger. And Scotland undoubtedly is in pole position to capture the lion's share of that market. We're there just now, but there's other geographies that are also looking at the development for floating offshore wind. And we've got to work really hard locally to make sure that we maintain that position in the floating offshore wind space as being market leaders.
And just mentioning one or two other projects, you mentioned these projects that are coming through in terms of the ScotWind leasing round. As many of you know, I'm an electrical engineer, so I get quite excited about the grid investment as well, although much more has to be done. So the Western Link, for example, the subsea DC link, very important for our export conditions, but also very important for network resilience across the UK and the prospective Eastern Green Link. You know, goes back to my systems proposition that you maybe heard me saying earlier on. We need that integration between the priorities for the national agenda, as it were. We need to deploy technologies, much of which already exists at the moment, but we still need to look forward in innovation. Yeah. But we need to think about how do we actually deliver this. So the grid investment is enormous. You know my connections with Scottish Power and Vice Chairman there. I mean, what they will be taking into the next price review, what SSE are planning to do. Multiple tens of millions of pounds worth of investment in grid, and it's necessary because in many ways we've still been living on the nature of the network that has been around for decades. Yep. And we have to now imagine the architecture and the technologies that are going to take us into 2050. Much of that will be at transmission, but there's a chance now to think about what this means for local distribution systems as well. And the ubiquitous reference to smart grid. If you ask 5 people a definition for smart grid, you might get 5 different definitions. But this idea of automated, sensed, reactive networks is really quite exciting. Yeah. And if you deploy the right control systems, you can actually increase the available capacity to connect renewables. The other projects I would mention briefly before Ronnie and I move on to investment conditions, because it's going to be critical. If we think of other projects, as well as these grid projects, and it's back to NIG. We've mentioned oil and gas and those champions that are taking us forward. Sir Ian Wood himself being a champion for that transition. Roy McGregor is a mutual friend of ours who's the Chief Executive at Global Energy. What he's doing in NIG is absolutely inspirational. Creating hundreds of jobs, apprenticeships. And up in NIG now, because of that vision and others, Sumitomo Electric UK Power Cables, £350 million inward investment to establish a major operation there in NIG. And Roy, think about clearing the port side there to be able to build floating offshore wind capability. Entrepreneurship, large-scale engineering, and what you're hearing from us time and time again is scale and pace, de-risk investment. Other things that have happened, Greenvolt, just going forward now. We've already mentioned Alan McCaskill, but Nicol Stephen in there as well. They've just been taken over by TEPCO. Really interesting. There we have an international company bought into their company, Floating Energy, and now the Greenvolt project coming through. It'll be the order of about £3 billion worth of investment.
Absolutely.
About 600 megawatts of floating offshore wind. Could be one of the biggest deployments in the world. So that risk appetite as a nation, and the risk appetite we need from government, industry and those that invest in them, the risk matrix is very important because we need to understand how we mitigate and navigate and deal with these things. But very often what tells me more about an organisation and an individual is not that the fact that they have a risk matrix and their mitigations, that's important, but I want to understand their risk appetite. And we need to, again, with no disrespect to our politicians, the big statements about the direction of travel are fine, but it needs to be followed up by a demonstration of the risk appetite to actually get us there. And the other project I would see, you've mentioned Ardesir, Ronnie, that's a joint credit facility for £100 million, de-risking the opportunity to deploy fixed and floating offshore wind, and many more. So net-net, there'll be about £1.5 billion worth of underpinning investment that's happened in the past couple of years.
Which is really just the type of the iceberg that's required as well, because the floating offshore wind opportunity is going to be a multiple £100 billion opportunity in the UK and the wider market. We look at the projects that Jim mentioned, the Greenvolt floating offshore wind project in Pentland, who are currently in a position to move forward, but they're going to be subject to the CFD auction that's going to take place later this year. So they have got to be able to secure that funding to enable them to take it to the next stage. And that's where the opportunity for Scotland lies going forward, is on the floating offshore wind. We saw the announcement yesterday, which was great, about the collaboration between the ports in Scotland as well. I think that's really key to try and take an element of the competition out of these facilities, because they're all going to be required. So the more that we could work together to do these developments in concert, the better it's going to be for the sector as a whole.
And let me calibrate with a few numbers, and then Ronnie will lead us into just some thinking about the investment conditions and incentives that are there. I spoke to colleagues from Skills Development Scotland earlier this week in advance of this meeting. I remember, I chair the Scottish Government's Scottish Energy Advisory Board. I was the inaugural co-chair and I've stayed in ever since. I started with Alex Salmond, then moved on to Ms Sturgeon, and then latterly Mr Yusuf, and I'm happy to say Mr Swinney will be co-chairing SEAB as we go forward. But the night before the first SEAB met, 2009 I think it was, I spoke to Mr Salmond and I said, well, what we're going to put in the agenda, because it had been, shall we say, lightly drafted at that point. And we wanted to do a model of what the innovation and technology capability was in Scotland. So that map came forward, supported by Scottish Enterprise and the Scottish University sector. I said the key thing we need to look at is skills. So that first meeting, Alex charged Skills Development Scotland to create what became Scotland's first skills investment plan in energy. Now, at that time, what's that, 15 years ago now, some of the numbers were very exciting and very few of them have actually come to pass. And in offshore wind in particular, I think about 10% of them have actually come to the fore. So it's incumbent upon us in the system that this potential must be realised. SDS, with support from other analysts, have said offshore wind, currently 9,500 jobs in Scotland, could grow by 2030 to 54,000 jobs. 17,000 through the fixed fleet, 37,000 through floating. Onshore wind, about 3,500 currently. Hydrogen, currently 50. And they're saying by 2030 that could grow to about, on average, about 7,000 jobs. And beyond that, to 2035, up to 18,000 jobs. Now, I can't validate these are projections, but they're models that have been done by Oppergy Data, by the Fraser of Allender Institute, that's part of my organisation, and in CCUS, that was a big number back 15 years ago. Yeah. It's currently 100, but they're now projecting back out to CCUS by 2028 to 2035 to 15,000 jobs and more. Solar's there as well. So the size of the prize here, if we get lined up here, is many tens of thousands of jobs, and there are not many sectors in Scotland that have that growth potential. But of course, before we do that, we need to attract the investment, Ronnie.
Absolutely, and there was quite a few times when you were rattling off these numbers, Jim, where you used the expression could.
Yes.
And I could have sat in an audience 10 years ago and heard about projections that could materialise by 2024. Some of them have come to fruition in terms of deployment, some of them haven't. in terms of supply chain growth in the local economy, etc. So there's an obligation on all of us to make sure that we turn these coulds into wills, you know, to make sure that these jobs and these targets that have been set actually do materialise in the time frame that we expect. And the only way we can deliver that is creating the right environment for investment. Because in the early days, risk appetite was relatively low in the offshore wind space. Now, investors are crumbling over the sector to get opportunities to effectively deploy that capital. I do some advisory work for an organisation called Copenhagen Infrastructure Partners. They've got a target to accumulate 100 billion euros of money to invest in green technologies by the end of this decade. And they always do that in project finance, like most developers do. So you need a pipeline of about 750 billion projects to put that to work. It's incredible, you know. But you need to create the right environmental, the investment environment in the UK to provide that. The first and obvious one that everyone talks about is the timeline during the development phase for a project. Now, I'm not saying that we abandon all the rigour that we go through in terms of taking a project through to consent, but I'm sure we could be more efficient at what we do and come up with a robust process that delivers these necessary consents in a timely manner. The local supply chain as well. We obviously want to do stuff locally where we can, but you need to create the right environment to do that. So regulation and policy has got a big part to play here. You know, we talk about all these net zero goals, which are sometimes decades away, and we're trying to address that through bite chunks as we go along. And that really doesn't get us to where we need to be. So there really is a lot of things that can be done to make sure that the UK and Scottish offshore wind opportunity is seen the best place to invest. We see things happening in other parts of the globe, in Taiwan, where it's like sort of cooled down a little bit. In the US, everybody's paranoid about a new Trump administration. We've got a great opportunity here to attract a significant amount of investment, and it's going to be providing that element of certainty that people need. Now, that money, everybody thinks, is only required to deliver the projects, to provide the finance to the developers that are going to build these projects. We also need to get a significant amount of investment into the UK and Scotland, and Jim's rattled off a few that have already taken place, but again, that's just the tip of the iceberg. And the only way we can create that environment is to provide long-term certainty for the developers to take that risk and for entice the company from overseas to come and invest in the supply chain, and also for the local supply chain companies themselves to have the confidence to make long-term investments for their facilities. So the key line is certainty in terms of create that right environment.
Good. And rather than me repeat that, let me just, for those of you who were in the session this morning, let me just capture that informal wordle that I was constructing as people were presenting, and it resonates very well with what Ronnie's saying. Policy certainty is key. I think we recognise that as people look to invest, you know, multiple tens, if not hundreds of billions of pounds, they need to understand that, you know, if we switch every 3 to 4 years, then there's other more secure places in the world to spend your money, where the ambition seems high and the ambition and the risk appetite is high. So policy certainty, the strategic planning and delivery. It was interesting for us to hear this morning our colleague from National Grid talk about the need for that overarching strategic plan. I mean, the term was used a long time ago. A friend of mine, John Scott, who used to be a senior executive in National Grid, went into Ofgem and became its first engineering director, which was great. I was delighted to see, you know, all these excellent and well-skilled economists being supported by an engineer that was trying to take that overarching system perspective. And he talked about the need for a systems architect. We need to know where we're going in terms of the system design. What is it we're trying to achieve? And that's basically systems. That's an engineering systems frame of mind, recognising where the key interdependencies are and how one gets to that 2030, 2035 and beyond strategy, but make decisions now and deploy now in a way that doesn't lock you out from achieving that longer term goal. The other things we heard this morning was about confidence. And that's back to risk appetite and entrepreneurship, strategic relationships between government, industry and investors, which we'll probably conclude on, Ronnie. But the will is really great here. I think the important thing is now is movement. And that's extremely important. I mean, let's just say a little bit about the system that we're trying to design, and then we'll maybe move to some concluding remarks, Ronnie. So we talked a lot about the grid this morning. We're talking about offshore wind, hydrogen. How does that gas and electricity system actually integrate, decarbonising of homes, decarbonising of the construction industry, all the way through to CCUS and beyond. These are complex systems, and it makes my toes curl when I see things being polarised between nuclear and wind and decarbonising and hydrogen. There are policy constraints wherever you might be, but we need to understand that we need that overarching system perspective, whether it's within Scotland, the UK or beyond, into an interconnected European grid. But with that system design, and it's starting to come through things like the holistic network design that some of you may know about, all the way through to the acceleration for transmission investments. Once we sign up for a national strategy, national objective, then that's about how we play in priorities. And the regional approach that we have here is important. Place matters. And we said, if I just look back to that just transition place, we talked about NIG in Aberdeen. You can see these microcosms of that systems approach, stimulating jobs, stimulating investment, and then networked together, it starts to become a national capability.
Yeah, it does.
And once you do that, you deliver a national plan, and once you're proven that and secured the investment, you're then fit for an international market engagement.
Exactly. I think you're right, Jim. In terms of the export opportunity in the international market is really dependent on having a really successful and buoyant domestic market in that space. And the national plan that you refer to, and the industrial growth plan, was published just a couple of weeks back. I think that's a great opportunity for us to coalesce on the key points that need to be driven to delivery to make sure that we capitalise on this fantastic opportunity that's in front of us. But that is going to require a lot of collaboration between the developers, industry, government, etc. So the opportunity is great. We should also not forget the part that innovation plays in R&D. I think that's becoming more to the fore. We're world leaders from decades back. We could go even centuries back, but in terms of oil and gas sector, we were seen as the go-to place for innovative technologies and solutions that were going to address some of the challenges that ultimately came up in that sector. We've got exactly the same challenges on the offshore oil and gas, offshore renewables, and we've got the skill sets and the facilities that are there in place to help us address those particular challenges that come to fruition. So we're really well placed to effectively continue to build a buoyant domestic market and obviously outsource or outship that expertise across the globe.
And just as we conclude, I say often, we need to stay optimistic while applying pragmatism. For me, one of the most sustainable fuels is optimism. We're talking about trying to attract young people into our industry. There's much to be concerned about when you see, just over the past few weeks, the climate scientists getting very nervous about us already going through 1.5 degrees. I think I told some of you this morning, I had the pleasure of spending some time with Steve Chu last Thursday, including having dinner with him, Obama's Energy Secretary. And he's not given up on 1.5, but the data that he shared shows that we're already through 1.5. And then we're talking, as came through COP over the past couple of years, is well below 2 degrees. That is looking challenging. And if you just imagine what a 3-degree temperature shift looks like by the end of this century. Steve came out with a nice line. He said, we don't need to model or simulate what 3 degrees temperature rise looks like. All we need to do geologically is look back several tens of thousands of years and see what it looked like. It looked like another 6 to 8 metres high oceans. It looked like major changes to what the planet looks like in terms of landmass available for us living on. So it's sobering, and we should be concerned about it, and we must be concerned about it. But if we don't do something about it, that would be the shame. Understanding what the challenge is and getting a degree of international cooperation is important. And of course, if we're attracting our youth into this system, then we need to be optimistic enough to say that they are part of the solution. So we need to educate them, train them, inspire them, and then take the responsibility as an industry community, as an academic community, very importantly, our decision makers and policy makers as a community. The triple helix that Ronnie talked about there, I can give you other partners in there, academia, industry and policy makers, but always optimism. Much of what's happened is because of our intervention. The solution must come by our intervention. And that's exactly what I think we intend to be involved in.
Absolutely, and I think we should be really bold about taking on this energy transition full on, because it's nothing new for us. We did an energy transition of a similar scale a few decades ago, so we're experts at that. The one last thing I would like to say, it'd be remiss of me not to make reference to some sort of major developments in the Catapult over the last few months. We had the official opening of the Floating Wind Innovation Centre in Aberdeen, which went down great, invested £10 million in that facility. We've already got people knocking at the door. And the fantastic investment that was announced earlier this week in Blyth, an £86 million grant from UKRI, which will effectively enable us to repurpose that facility for the next generation turbine. So we've got all the right ingredients to make this a huge success. We just need to collaborate and work together to deliver on that.
Well done.
Well, what can one say but wow? I wish this could go on and on and on, but unfortunately, ports are queuing outside to come in. But thank you, gentlemen. That was absolutely fascinating. We should perhaps, if we ever do it again, allow an hour, because once you were both wound up, I had a terrible feeling I was never going to stop you, and I didn't want to stop you. What do you think? I think a very loud round of applause.
Well done.